How's everybody doing today? Good. Learning a lot so far? No? Tough crowd? I know I've learned a lot, and I'm still a newcomer to the Drupal scene, so a lot of stuff thrown at me today, but it's pretty good stuff. But I just want to start off by saying thanks to the organizers for putting this together. Thanks for the opportunity for having me on stage here today, and thank you to you guys mostly for actually coming out to listen to some of us speak. So just by way of introductions, my name is Duncan, and I'm a front-end developer at an agency here in town called Manifest. I'm pretty new to Drupal, like I said before, and been working on it for about 6 months now. So a lot of it is still pretty new to me, but we do have guys on the team who are more experienced with it. So whenever I have a lot of questions, it's like I just pepper them with it. But besides Drupal, the agency I work for does a lot of stuff in the mobile app space and the social media space as well. That is my Twitter handle. You can find me on Twitter if you have any thoughts, questions, comments. Feel free to reach out. I'll send out a link to my slides and stuff on Twitter, and I'll also post them to the Drupal Camp STL site. So why this topic, challenges of designing for CMS? Over the years, just having worked in agencies pretty much my entire career, I've done a lot of stuff with CMSs, custom ones, and more mainstream ones like WordPress, Perch, Umbraco, Adobe CQ5, and more recently Drupal. But I think the idea for this talk kind of came about after my experience with Adobe's CQ5 product. And it was one of those come to Jesus moments where you're just like, being pretty new to CQ5 and getting thrust into that project, you kind of like, it came to a point I was like, we're just doing things really, really wrong. But we still delivered a product in time. But like I said, a lot of lessons were learned along the way, and that's where this talk pretty much came from. That was pretty much me at the end of the project. Just like, yeah, that was not fun. Like I said, I call it challenges of designing for CMS, but design is not just something that's about, how things look visually. I think design is also, code is part of design. How we set up admin interfaces in Drupal is design as well, because it all kind of goes back to that user experience as well. And some of the talks here today have kind of addressed some of that. So that kind of feeds into what I'm going to talk about today. So what are these challenges we face when designing for CMSs? There are lots of different challenges, but for the most part, they basically fall into 4 buckets. It's going to be something to do with content. It's going to be something to do with technology. It's going to be something to do with the people on the project. And it's going to have something to do with the visual design. So we're going to go through each of these one by one. And we're going to start off with content. Most of us work on Drupal, I assume. Everybody works on Drupal here? No hands up, but I'm going to say yes. But, we all know what the definition of a CMS is, a program that basically enables us to collaborate on editing and publishing content. Content is a big piece of what people come to us for in terms of visiting our websites and so on. So it goes without saying that when you're working on building out a site, designing a site or putting it together or whatever, the first thing you want to have is the actual content for the site, especially when you're working with a CMS. Jeffrey Zeldman, who most of us consider the godfather of web design, put out a quote, and it went along the lines of, content precedes design. Design in the absence of content is not design, it's decoration. So if you're working with an existing site, you're already working with pre-existing content, so that makes life a little easier for you, unless you're actually going to be overhauling the entire content that you have and coming up with fresh content. But if you start from scratch, you're going to have to develop a content strategy for your site and come up with a content model as well. And some of this is stuff that Ken already talked about earlier on today, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But, and Ken actually liked this definition better than yours. It's a lot shorter. But I just wanted to emphasize the importance of working with real content. Ken kind of talked about how, an article title, I think he said, it's In Defense of Lorem Ipsum. I think I would actually disagree with that. I think for me, I'd actually rather have actual content on a wireframe, or if not, actually not show any content on a wireframe at all. There's some examples of wireframe kits that will basically abstract the content out for you and just display it as little lines or boxes, essentially. But I think I'd rather actually see actual content on a wireframe, as well as on designs that get presented to clients and so on. And the reason for this is you really need content to know how things are actually going to behave on your site. It's going to show you how content looks on certain fields. It's going to show you how tables react on the site, especially when it's starting to talk about responsive content and so on. Dummy content often results in lots of little problems, and sometimes sets unrealistic assumptions and serious design flaws because they're not really reflective of the actual application itself. So just a few examples of what can happen when dummy content goes wrong. The one on the left is an app, and we had a very cranky developer that day. The one on the right is a newspaper, and in it, I guess they were supposed to put a pull quote, and they never got around to that, and they actually printed out something about heary. So pretty embarrassing stuff. Just a couple more examples. The one on the left is a wine bottle, and it's actual lorem ipsum text. The one on the right is a newspaper article, and I guess they were not too sure about who those two people were. But that actually got printed in the actual newspaper. So it's pretty embarrassing stuff. So I would say always have content before you actually start to do anything. The next one is probably a lot tougher to answer, choosing a CMS. Most of us are here for Drupal camps, so the assumption is we're working with Drupal. But most of the time, CMS selection is actually left to somebody who has a more technical background or somebody in the IT department. And the decision they tend to make is based on who they're affiliated with or what's currently popular or whatever corporate rules the organization might have in place. Content editors, who are actually the most knowledgeable people when it comes to your site because they actually edit the content on it, are often bypassed when these decisions are being made. And they often are afraid to speak up because they feel they don't have the technical capacity to be part of these conversations. But they are a huge part of making this decision because they're the ones who are going to be up there making edits to the content. And if you give them something that they're either not familiar with or something that's just not helpful to them, it kind of makes their life a lot harder. So you always want to make sure that you kind of involve all the right people when you're choosing the CMS. Now, picking up a CMS is not about the features that it has. Drupal has a lot of features. There's a lot of modules being developed. WordPress has a lot of plugins. WordPress can do this. Drupal can do that. That should never be how you go about picking up CMS. There's no surefire way of actually picking out which one you should use. But the process of doing so, you actually have to begin with content once again and figure out, does this CMS work with the content I'm going to have at the end? Now, I can't remember who the name of the guy who came up with this process, but I'll find it and post it out later. But what he did was come up with, when thinking about content, how can we use content to help us make a decision on how to pick a CMS? And what he decided was, we can always start with two things. One, if you have a content strategy, which at this point you should have, you can pull out a content model from it and use it as the first step of helping you select the CMS. And then the second thing is to determine which tasks, which publishing tasks are going to be taken on the site. So a content model can be thought of as basically a database schema for your content, or part of the information architecture. And Ken touched on this earlier on, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. But the second step of determining what tasks, what you're basically doing is saying, okay, I'm a content editor. Here are the things I'm going to be doing on a daily basis. Taking the Drupal camp STL website, for example, a task could be something as simple as I'm going in to add a speaker. I'm going in to add a session. So those are the things that people are going to be doing on a regular basis. And you want to have a list of here are all the things we're going to be doing, and then you kind of prioritize here are the most important ones, because that's really going to guide your decision as to what you actually pick and how you actually go about building the back end that these content editors are going to be going in to actually make the content edits for you. So once you have those two things done, you want to ask yourself a few questions. Can the tool that I pick out, or the tools that I'm assessing, can they handle the content model that I've basically come up with? And can it do so natively, or is it going to need customization? If it needs customization, how much is required to actually implement the task flow that we have? And finally, how long is that actually going to take given the available technical resources? Now, there are a bunch of other questions to consider as well, such as like, what's it going to cost to maintain this thing? Do we need a developer on hand whenever we need to move like Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, Drupal 7 to Drupal 8? But this is a pretty good starting point to help you make your decision. The people part, I'd also already kind of started on a little bit when I said that you need to include a lot of people in helping you pick out a CMS, content editors most especially. But you also have to ask yourself, who are you designing for? Whenever you're building a site, we're always thinking about what I guess we call the end user, the people who are coming to our sites for our content, the people who are coming to buy our products or services or whatever it is we're selling. But there are more users than that. There are content editors. There are people who approve the content that the content editors are putting in. There are site administrators. There are developers who have to go in and edit modules or plugins or stuff like that. Each of these play a different role, but you always have to account for them. Whenever you're choosing a design, whenever you're designing it, and whenever you're actually building it. I like this quote. A great, flexible, and easy-to-use CMS is only one person away from being transformed into something that's completely unusable and frustrating, or empowering and strategic. So whatever you're starting off, always have the right people at the table. It's just going to make your life a whole lot easier down the road. Just to get a poll, how many people are actually developers or actually do any Drupal developments? Go 1, 2. Content strategists, designers, 2. What does everybody else do?
I don't really know. I'm a trainer filling in.
There's this debate about that's been going on for a while about should designers learn how to code. And the argument is that you need to learn how to code so that you know how to design better for the medium you're working in. And coming back to Drupal and content strategy, and Ken, you like stole everything I wanted to say, Ken. Everybody should be a content strategist, whether you're a developer, you're a designer. You might not think you are, but you actually are, whether from a technical perspective or from just the regular definition of being a content strategist. If you think about it, you're going into the CMS, you're setting up fields, you're actually adding content, you're managing a lot of stuff. So in reality, you're doing a lot of tasks that an actual content strategist is going to be doing. So even though you don't think of yourself as a content strategist, you actually are. And I think this is something that's pretty important because I think the things that we do on the web are all really connected. Developers do a lot of stuff that touches on design, so it's important that they know how to, they understand basics of design. Just the same way developers expect designers to know how to code, because then they know how to work better in that medium. So technical architecture and implementation of a CMS, I think a lot of people actually do touch on that, even though they think they don't. If you go in and install a module yourself, you're actually handling some of the technical aspects of it. So in reality, you're kind of doing more than you think you're actually doing. Jumping on visual design. I'm in the camp that believes that designers don't really need to know actual code. I think just understanding what code can and cannot do is more beneficial. And I have the same philosophy when it comes to designing for a CMS. Actually know how the tool works. And I think as developers, I'm a developer myself, I feel like we fail a lot of people when it comes to educating them on how the tools actually work. Drupal or WordPress or whatever CMS it is. I think it's really important for us to, get people to know the actual tools, give them credentials to actually log in and see how stuff works. Don't just design in a vacuum and then expect the developer to implement the design that you put together. I think it's important for everybody to jump in to see how things work. Go in, add content, whether it's if it's a dummy site that you're just creating to teach people how to use the tool. I think that's really important because then they start to see that, oh, this is a lot harder than I actually thought it was. Maybe I'll design things to make it a little easier to implement some of the things we're trying to go for. Understanding how templates are created, that's really huge. And all the different possibilities that Drupal and any other CMS is going to offer. Just getting this insight helps out a lot. Going back to my CQ5 experience that I was talking about earlier, I did not know anything about Adobe CQ5, but we got tasked with building out the site, putting the design together, and handing it off to the client. So I feel like I failed in that I had no prior knowledge of CQ5, and I basically didn't jump in and set up a test installation of it and just see how it works. What actually ended up happening was I got a visual design, I implemented the front end of it, and I was getting ready to hand it off to the back-end developer. And what happens is the back-end guy's like, you know what, I'll take these templates and I'll make them work. Great. I thought my part is done. I'll just be coming in to help out with some maintenance type stuff. A few days later, he comes back and says, you know what you put together is just not going to work because CQ5 doesn't work this way. So we're like, there was that disconnect between what he was expecting and what I put together. My idea of a CMS was you put templates together and those either get broken down as they are, but CQ5 didn't work that way. CQ5 worked in a completely different way. So I should have gone in and learned how CQ5 worked. The backend guy should have taught me how CQ5 worked. The designers should have found out how CQ5 worked so they designed better for it. But that really would have alleviated a lot of the common problems that we run into. We say that content is king. Content is really what people come for. And a lot of the issues that we have on sites, especially when it comes to the design aspect of it, is how content breaks the layout, how content breaks everything else. Is this paragraph too long? If I have a line that wraps into two, will that completely break the site, or will it do some really, really weird things? Will the background image get distorted if I put in one that's much bigger than we might be expecting? And I think those are the things that, unless you have experience jumping into the CMS and actually doing it yourself, you won't really understand some of these things. I've come to learn the hard way that when you hand off a CMS to people, always expect the unexpected. And you have to really design in a really bulletproof way or develop in a really bulletproof way. Just like I was saying, if text is too long. Like, then maintaining the integrity of the design is really important. If it's important to you, then these are things that you really want to account for. But yeah, pretty much knowing the possibilities, actually knowing that the unexpected is going to happen, helps you prepare for a lot of these issues down the road. Another big part is thinking in terms of components and designing things in a more modular fashion. Most of the time what happens, especially in the agency world, is you'll get a design of a web page, and that would be an entire design from top to bottom. But if you really think about it, each page that exists is made up of smaller components that make up the entire page. Some of these components are reused on multiple pages, so you can think of like sliders and stuff like that, or something that holds the 5 recent comments and so on. So we really should be designing more components and not thinking about designing a full page, because it's a lot easier to do components and then figure out, if I put these 5 together, it can create this page for me. But I think it also helps from a design perspective in terms of coming up with designs a lot quicker. Trying to think of a page as a whole is a lot harder than it is thinking about smaller components that can then be pieced together a lot easier. Dan Moll came up with this concept. He calls it element collages. And just like I was saying, a full comp requires ideas to be fully realized. And he found that element collages help him to come up with designs a lot better. The basic gist of it, like I was saying, is you're starting to think about smaller components. So this is an example of a site that he did. And towards the top, we kind of have those small donate buttons. So what he did was, I want to start working with this, start thinking about designing the buttons. And this is what the button's going to look like when I hover on it. These are the effects that are going to, be there when people interact with these buttons. But he was basically thinking in terms of small pieces. Down at the bottom, we have here the different treatments that content or copy could actually have, different headline fonts and so on. So just thinking in this way, I think is a lot better and helps you to actually get stuff out the door a lot quicker. Also helps when you're trying to get stuff in front of your client for approval. They're not getting hung up on, here's the entire page, oh, I don't like this thing here, I don't like this thing there. You're just showing them smaller components that can then be put together, and you can quickly rearrange things whenever you need to. I usually shoot for pretty small, short presentations. And I just wanted to end with, where is the future of the CMS? I think by now a lot of us have heard of Facebook's instant articles, where they're working with different publishers like National Geographic and so on to have their content displayed on Facebook. And it had me thinking about, so what is the content strategy that these publishers then have? How do they get their content out to things like Facebook? And that took me back to NPR. NPR has this strategy of getting content out to different platforms, different mediums. It's the same content, but they just get it in a lot more places. And they call their strategy COPE. Create once, not create one, actually I need to edit that. Create once, publish everywhere. But the idea is that you have all these journalists putting stuff together, but you want to see it on your phone as an app. You want to see it on a mobile site. You want to see it on a desktop site. But not all the content that's put together for an article, for instance, has to appear on each of these different mediums. You might show a lot more features on a desktop than you would on an actual mobile phone and so on, or on an app. So what they did was came up with this strategy of, we're going to have all our articles be standardized essentially, all have the same types of content pieces. It's also going to have a title, so it's going to have a subtitle. It's going to have maybe a blurb that quickly describes what this article is about and so on. And then depending on where you are, what you actually see could be parts of those Could be the entire piece of the article, the title, subtitle, content, and so on. Or if you're on a phone, for instance, we could skip out with the subtitle, skip out with a blurb, and just have, here's the title, here's the content, end of story. And I think a lot of what we do is probably headed that way. We might not necessarily see it right now with our websites or with clients that we're working on, but it's something that we want to start thinking about. Can Drupal, for instance, allow us to publish content in a lot of different places and not just on the websites that we're working on? This is kind of what their strategy was in terms of putting this together. You're making actual content management systems, not website publishing tools, and I think that's a very significant distinction to make. Separating content from display, like that goes back to the whole conversation of have your content first before thinking about anything else. Content modularity. Can you have content pieces that you can basically abstract from everything else and have it still stand on its own? And ensuring content portability, and that's can my content appear on a desktop site? Can it appear on a mobile app? Can I syndicate it and have it appear on a completely different blog without me having to do a lot of rework? And I think a lot of what we do, this is where we're headed, and it's something we really have to start thinking about. Can Drupal actually handle this? Are we prepared for it? But that's what I pretty much have for you guys. Questions, comments? No?
I'll chime in. That was nice, and it was very complimentary, of course, if anybody was in my session as well. The focus on the CMS, so just taking it a step further in architecture. I think to that point that you raised about lorem ipsum, I'm not particularly a fan of lorem ipsum, but I think at the end of the day we're saying the same thing. I think you need to have clear definition of content, and content strategy leads design. Everyone's on the same page with that. I think what I didn't get into was I think definitions are certainly needed, and I think for the content development team to work with the UX team to see that the content strategy will work within the wireframe is a needed one. Whether or not actual content is needed, I think is debatable, and maybe something left for happy hour to get into.
Okay.
But I've seen meetings actually derailed to start talking about content when that's not the purpose of that meeting. Okay. And I think that's where it serves a certain functional thing. So whether for your internal team you're making sure that system works within the wireframe, but replacing that content with something that the client won't get hung up about.
Right.
Words are loaded, very loaded, and I think that's where things have a risk. So do you guys usually have actual content fleshed out when that's presented, or is it a case where you work with the best content you have, it's still being developed, but real words, real
So
language?
this is best case scenario. You know how
Okay.
agency worlds are hard.
Right.
What we want is not necessarily what we're doing.
Yeah.
But we've done it different ways. Most times, though, it's gonna be dummy content, and you're right in that you don't want clients getting too hung up on it. But I think at the same time, if you kind of get your content done earlier on before you jump into wireframes, then maybe you've already kind of like sorted all that stuff out.
Yeah.
And when you have it in the wireframes, we're not focusing on the content. We're focusing on the structure and how stuff is put together.
Right.
But yeah, for the most part, it's still a lot of dummy content that we'll see in wireframes that get pushed out.
Yeah. And I ran out of time because yours was much more concise and eloquent, but one thing, unfortunately, the demo I didn't get into with the demo is showing how a tool like that can actually aid the wireframing process, because you are actually putting in the field limits in the what you're describing there and all that stuff. And I think that process solves the problem that you're describing of something coming out of left field and getting dropped into a content area that's not the intent, or that's not the
Right.
Thing
Yeah.
like that. So it's definitely a different perspective, but I think at the end of day, we're talking about the same thing, where content informs everything
Right.
that comes out of it. So,
Yeah.
kudos.
So what sort of methodology do you guys use for designing? Do you guys use the agile approach or your own thing? I mean, we're kind of struggling a little bit with, we use agile or a form of agile and kind of slicing our stories up around the way Drupal is structured is a little challenging for us. So I just wanted to hear what you guys might be using out there.
We've used a mix. I think a lot of clients are used to the waterfall approach.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's a little hard to kind of get them out of that and into a more agile approach. But we have started transitioning with some clients where we either go full on agile or we try a combination of both. Sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, but it's at least a step away from the whole waterfall approach, because I personally do not like the waterfall approach because I'm the last guy in the chain. I'm the one who gets screwed at the end. So I really.
They change it all up at the very end.
Yeah, leave no time.
Yeah, and then you have no time to actually go in and actually fix anything. So I'd love to get away from waterfall, but yeah, we've used a combination. So it depends on the client and what they are willing to work with.
So, and on that part about the content being in one spot or one, I know on our website we have a couple of things that I think we probably need to look at and consolidate in one spot. I think we do have multiple, and it is kind of bad design to have a link here that's the same link here. So, how do you handle that? You guys organize like your content links around one page, and then you slice and dice it up a little bit differently to maintain that one area?
I think more in terms of, say, if you have, here are 5 recent articles, and then you have a link that points to a different page. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, it's
Or-
sort of kind of like that. I know there's, when our content manager type person puts it out here, they'll also have to put it out here and here in different maybe taxonomies or different spots, but it's the same thing.
Gotcha.
Do you guys consolidate that more on one page and then refer to the same one in a lot of those? Or?
So, I think I personally, in the work we've done, haven't seen anyone having to put a link
Multiple.
to anything. For the most part, it's Drupal can tell you, or will tell you based off of the node ID or something, what the actual link to the article is. So all of that is pretty much automated. All you're doing is putting in the text that says, go here to read more about this article or whatever it is. So for the most part, that's automated. So we've never had an instance where somebody actually has to go in and manually put in a link to, right, yeah.
Okay.
Well, unless you're talking about the like the body of the article where you do want to link to maybe something completely different, then I think that's a different case, because then you do have to, there is no way to go in and automate that. But yeah, if it's something you can automate using PHP, that's probably the way to do it. Any more questions? No? All right, thank you.